My name is Elena Ward. I'm in my late 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in corporate operations. Those quiet, unglamorous roles that keep companies running while someone else takes the credit. If you'd passed me in the hallway back then, you probably would have thought I was competent, polite, maybe a little reserved. The kind of person who listens more than she speaks. The kind of woman people assume will handle it without needing recognition. That assumption followed me everywhere. At work, I was known as reliable, calm under pressure, low maintenance. I didn't dominate meetings or lobby for visibility. I delivered. On time, cleanly, without friction. To some, that made me easy to work with. To others, it made me easy to overlook. And to a few, it made me convenient. This is not a story about a dramatic takedown or a loud victory. There's no shouting match, no viral moment, no single villain you can point to and say, that's the one. It's a story about something quieter and far more common. How being underestimated can slowly turn into being diminished, and how choosing not to react can become a form of power when it's done with intention. I want to be clear about something up front. What you're about to hear isn't fueled by revenge. There's no humiliation, no public exposure, no fantasy justice. Everything that happened unfolded within the rules. Professional, legal, and ethical. The shift was internal first. The consequences came later. This story moves slowly, because real workplace harm usually does. It begins with small cuts that are easy to explain away. A tone, a look, a decision made without you in the room. It moves through years of normalization, moments where you tell yourself you're being too sensitive, that this is just how things are, that staying quiet is maturity. And then, almost imperceptibly, it reaches a point where silence stops being passive and becomes deliberate. There was a time when I believed my value spoke for itself, when I trusted that consistency would protect me, when I thought patience was the same as wisdom. What I learned, gradually, and without bitterness, is that organizations don't respond to unspoken value. They respond to structure, leverage, and boundaries, and people often don't realize what you carry until you stop carrying it for them. As you listen, you might recognize pieces of yourself. The meetings where your work was summarized by someone else, the projects you stabilized but never owned, the way you calmed was mistaken for compliance. If that's you, I'm not here to tell you what you should have done. I'm here to document what happens when someone finally sees the full picture and acts without needing applause. This is an honest account of how I moved from invisible to undeniable without raising my voice, burning bridges, or becoming someone I didn't respect. It's about quiet dominance, not over people, but over my own choices. Before we begin, let me ask you gently, have you ever wondered how different your life would feel if your silence became intentional instead of expected? To them, I was the safe option. That's the phrase I would use now, looking back with clarity instead of confusion. I wasn't the visionary or the loud thinker or the person whose ideas reshaped the room the moment they spoke. I was the one you assigned when something had to work, when timelines were tight, when mistakes weren't an option. I was the person managers leaned on quietly and forgot publicly. In meetings, I was introduced last, if at all. My role was often summarized instead of explained, as if the details didn't matter. Elena handles the operation side, someone would say, and that was enough. No follow-up questions, no curiosity, just an assumption that I'd take care of whatever sat under that vague umbrella. I didn't interrupt to clarify. I didn't feel the need to prove myself. At least, that's what I told myself. My performance reviews were consistently positive. Words like dependable, steady, and low risk appeared again and again. I was praised for my composure, my lack of ego, my ability to just get on with it. At the time, I took those as compliments. I didn't yet understand that those same traits were slowly shaping the box they were placing me in. When cross-functional projects came up, I was included early and excluded late. I helped design workflows, flagged risks, solved bottlenecks. Then, when leadership updates were prepared, My contributions were condensed into bullet points under someone else's name. Not stolen outright, just absorbed, folded neatly into the narrative of the louder person in the room. No one was cruel about it. That's important. There were no raised voices, no overt disrespect, which made it harder to name what was happening. Everything stayed just polite enough to deny, just reasonable enough to excuse. I became known as easy. Easy to work with, easy to ask favors of, easy to rely on without formal authority. When someone forgot a deadline, it quietly became my problem. When a process failed, I was asked to take a look, even if I hadn't designed it. I fixed things, and the fixing became invisible. There's a particular kind of invisibility that comes from competence. It doesn't feel like rejection, it feels like trust. And that's why it's dangerous. People assumed I didn't want more. No one ever asked. They just filled in the silence with their own comfort. I was rarely challenged in meetings, not because my ideas were flawless, but because they were framed as implementation, not strategy. Execution, not direction. Support, not leadership. I watched colleagues with half my understanding move into roles with more visibility, simply because they narrated their thinking out loud. I told myself I preferred depth to spotlight, that I didn't need the noise. That fulfillment came from mastery, not titles. Some of that was true. Some of it was armor. What they didn't see was how much I noticed. I noticed who spoke over whom, who was credited, who was protected when mistakes happened. I noticed which questions were welcomed and which were tolerated. I noticed that calm women were often treated as background infrastructure, not decision makers. But I never corrected the perception. Not then. Because at that stage of my life, being underestimated felt safer than being exposed. It meant fewer battles, fewer politics, fewer risks, and I believed, naively, that consistency would eventually translate into recognition. To them, I was reliable, replaceable, but not easily, valuable, but not visibly so. I was the person you don't worry about, and therefore, the person you don't invest in. And at the time, I didn't yet realize how much power there is in being someone no one is watching closely. The first time it happened, I almost missed it. That's the thing about small cuts. They don't announce themselves. There was no meeting explosion, no sharp comment that echoed in the room. It arrived disguised as efficiency, as practicality, as something so minor that reacting would have seemed disproportionate. We were rolling out a new internal operation system. I had spent weeks mapping dependencies, stress testing scenarios, and coordinating quietly with IT, finance, and compliance. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was foundational. Without it, the launch would stall. 2 days before the executive review, my manager sent out the agenda. I wasn't on it. Not my name, just my work. Slides I had built, recommendations I had drafted, risks I had flagged. All are scheduled to be presented by someone else. A senior colleague with a louder presence and a reputation for big picture thinking. I stared at the email longer than I should have. Not because I was angry, but because I was confused. Surely it was an oversight, a formatting issue, something that would be corrected naturally. I told myself I didn't need to be in the room. The work spoke for itself. The system would succeed regardless of who presented it. That was the rationalization. It sounded mature, professional. The meeting came and went. I watched the recap notes circulate later that afternoon. Praise for the clarity of the rollout. Appreciation for the leadership shown in anticipating risks. My colleague was thanked by name. I wasn't mentioned. No one asked how it felt. No one noticed the absence. When I brought it up, carefully, lightly, it was brushed aside, just as gently. "You know how these things go," my manager said, smiling. "You're more of the engine than the face. That's your strength." Engine. Face. I nodded. I even smiled back. Because arguing would have made me seem insecure. Because pushing would have disrupted the calm image I had built. Because I didn't yet have the language to explain why something so small felt so wrong. Around me, no one reacted. The team moved on. Another deadline, another fire to put out. In the rhythm of corporate life, this was nothing. Barely a footnote, but I remembered it. Not as an injustice, but as data. I noticed how easily my presence could be removed without friction, how my contributions could be transferred without resistance, how silence was interpreted as consent. After that, similar moments began to surface. A document I authored is being forwarded without my name. A decision made using my analysis, delivered in someone else's voice. Always subtle, always deniable. Each time I told myself it wasn't personal, that I was reading too much into it, that being indispensable behind the scenes was its own kind of security. And maybe it was, for a while. What I didn't realize then was that the first small cut wasn't about credit. It was about positioning, about who was seen as owning outcomes versus supporting them, about who could be removed from the narrative without consequence. No one else marked the moment. There was no apology to accept or reject, nothing to forgive. But something shifted quietly inside me. Not anger, not resentment, awareness. I began to understand that respect, in environments like this, isn't only about how well you perform, it's about how visible your judgment is allowed to be. And once people get used to extracting value from you without acknowledging it, they rarely stop on their own. The first small cut didn't bleed, but it taught me exactly where the blade was. After the first small cut, nothing dramatic happened. That was what made it easy to dismiss. Life at work continued with its familiar pace. Status updates, planning sessions, quiet emergencies that needed smoothing over. No one treated me differently, at least not in ways that were obvious. And because nothing looked wrong, I told myself nothing was wrong. That's how normalization begins. It starts when you reinterpret discomfort as professionalism, when you tell yourself that not everything deserves a reaction, when you decide that maintaining harmony is more important than naming subtle disrespect. I had become very good at that kind of reasoning. The pattern was consistent but never identical. I would be brought in early to solve complex problems, then gradually edged out of the visible stages. My role remained essential, but my presence became optional. I was invited to meetings where plans were formed, not where decisions were announced. At first, I rationalized it as trust. They don't need me there because they know I've covered everything. That belief made me feel valued, even as it erased me. When colleagues asked for help, it was often framed as collaboration. Can I get your thoughts? You're really good at this. What do you think? And I would give them exactly what they asked for. Clear analysis, practical solutions, calm reasoning. I didn't withhold. I didn't hedge. Later, those same ideas would surface in leadership discussions without my name attached. Not maliciously, not deliberately, just reused. I told myself credit didn't matter as long as the outcome was right. That ego was a distraction. That being above office politics was a sign of maturity. But something else was happening underneath those justifications. Each time I stayed quiet, I reinforced an expectation. Each time I accepted being sidelined gracefully, I trained people to see my silence as agreement. Each time I downplayed my own contributions, I made it easier for others to do the same. There was also fear, though I didn't name it then. Fear of being seen as difficult. Fear of disrupting the calm, competent persona that had become my professional armor. Fear that if I asked for recognition, it would expose how much I wanted it. So I normalized the imbalance. When decisions were made without consulting me, even on systems I maintained, I told myself leadership needed space. When mistakes were traced back to areas I'd warned about and I was asked to quietly fix them, I told myself this was why I was trusted. When promotions went to people whose work I had stabilized behind the scenes, I congratulated them sincerely. And slowly, the role I played hardened. I wasn't just reliable anymore. I was expected to absorb complexity without acknowledgement, to smooth transitions without authority, to protect others from consequences without protection of my own. The worst part wasn't that others didn't notice. It was that I helped them not notice. I became fluent in minimization. It's fine. No big deal. I don't mind. Those phrases slipped out automatically. They sounded generous. They felt selfless, but they also erased boundaries. There were moments, small, quiet moments, when I felt a flicker of something sharper. A meeting where my suggestion was ignored until repeated by someone else. An email chain where my name disappeared as it moved up the hierarchy. A junior colleague was introduced as the brains behind this. While I sat beside them, invisible. Each time I swallowed the reaction. I told myself I was overreacting. That intention mattered more than impact. That staying calm was a strength. And it is a strength, but only when it's chosen freely. What I didn't see then was that my silence had shifted from being a personal trait to a professional expectation. People weren't taking advantage of me consciously. They were responding to the version of me I had consistently presented. Capable, agreeable, unthreatening. I had become essential, but not influential. And as long as I kept normalizing the disrespect, nothing around me had any reason to change. It wasn't assigned in a meeting. There was no announcement, no job description slid across a table. The role settled onto me the way dust does, slowly, invisibly, until one day I noticed it was everywhere. I was the stabilizer. The person you call when something is about to fall apart. The one who knows how the system actually works, not how it looks in presentations. I was the bridge between departments that didn't speak the same language, the buffer between leadership decisions and operational reality. And buffers are rarely thanked. They're just expected to hold. Over time, people stopped asking whether I wanted to take something on. They assumed I would. If a project was under-resourced, I was added just to make sure it runs smoothly. If a new hire needed guidance, I was asked to mentor them, unofficially, of course. If a process failed, I was looped in quietly, after the fact, to fix it before anyone higher up noticed. I became the person who prevented embarrassment. And preventing embarrassment has no visible metric. In meetings, my contributions were framed as support, not insight, not leadership, support. I was thanked for being helpful, for being flexible, for being such a team player. Those words sound positive, but they also signal something else, that your primary value is making things easier for others. When I proposed improvements, they were often implemented, but rarely attributed. When I raised concerns, they were noted, then filtered through someone else's voice. My judgment was trusted privately, but rarely endorsed publicly. And slowly, without realizing it, I stopped being seen as someone who set direction. I was someone who made direction work. That distinction matters. Because once you're placed in that role, people protect you from risk, but also from advancement. You become too useful where you are, too essential to move, too steady to promote. I noticed that when leadership talked about future roles, they spoke in terms of presence, gravitas, and vision. None of those words was ever used about me, not because I lacked them, but because I wasn't seen as someone who needed them. I was the dependable constant, the quiet baseline, the person you assume will still be there when others rotate in and out. There was a moment, small but sharp, when this fully crystallized. A reorganization was announced. New titles, new reporting lines. I scanned the document, expecting some shift, some recognition of the scope I had been carrying. My role was unchanged, not downgraded, just fixed, as if I were part of the infrastructure, not the growth plan. A colleague congratulated me later. "At least your job is stable," they said, meaning well. I smiled and thanked them, but inside something hardened. Stability had become a ceiling. I began to see how predictably people interacted with me. They came to me with problems, not possibilities, with requests, not invitations, with assumptions, not questions. And I accepted it, because rejecting it would have required me to redefine myself out loud, to disrupt expectations, to risk being misunderstood. At that point in my life, I still believed that patience would eventually be rewarded. That, if I just kept delivering, someone would notice the imbalance and correct it. What I didn't understand yet was this. Roles like the one I was assigned don't dissolve on their own. They persist because they serve everyone else too well. And as long as I stayed silent, I would remain exactly where they had quietly placed me. The day something shifted didn't look important from the outside. There was no confrontation, no breaking point that would make sense in hindsight. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in a small conference room with bad lighting and a flickering screen. I remember that detail because it felt strangely fitting. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic, just quiet discomfort settling into clarity. We were in a post-mortem meeting for a project that had gone sideways. Not failed, just underperformed. The kind of outcome leadership doesn't like, but also doesn't linger on. I had raised concerns months earlier, documented them, flagged risks in writing, offered alternatives. Most of it had been acknowledged politely and set aside. Now we were reviewing what went wrong. As people spoke, I listened. I always did. The narrative forming in the room was neat. External factors, market shifts, communication gaps. No one was lying. But no one was telling the full truth either. Then my manager spoke. They referenced a decision I had explicitly advised against. They framed it as a collective call, something we had aligned on. My name wasn't mentioned. My objections weren't either. I felt something inside me pause. Not anger, no surprise. Recognition. I realized, with absolute certainty, that the version of events being recorded, the one that would shape future decisions, did not include my judgment. My voice had been useful when it reduced risk, but inconvenient when it introduced accountability. For the first time, I saw the pattern as a whole. I could speak up in that moment, correct the record, remind the room of the emails, the notes, the warnings. I could assert myself calmly, professionally, and for a brief second, I considered it. Then I asked myself a different question. What would change if I did? The honest answer was, not much. The system wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as designed. Speaking up would have created momentary discomfort, maybe even acknowledgement, but it wouldn't have altered the underlying dynamic. I would still be the reliable stabilizer, the quiet absorber of risk. So I stayed silent. But this silence was different. It wasn't a resignation. It wasn't fear. It was a choice. As the meeting wrapped up, something in me settled, not with heaviness, but with calm. A calm that comes when you stop hoping for unspoken fairness and start observing reality as it is. Later that day, I opened my black notebook, the one I carried everywhere but rarely needed to use. I didn't write emotionally. I didn't vent. I documented dates, decisions, names, dependencies, patterns, not to weaponize them, to understand them. That was the shift. I stopped seeing myself as part of the emotional ecosystem of the workplace, seeking validation, fairness, acknowledgement. I began to see myself as a strategist inside a structure, someone who could choose how and where to invest effort. For the first time, I considered the possibility that staying might not be the same as progressing. That loyalty, without leverage, was just endurance. And more importantly, I realized that silence didn't have to mean invisibility. It could mean preparation. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't withdraw or disengage. From the outside, nothing changed. I attended meetings, delivered work, smiled at the right moments. But internally, I stopped waiting to be seen. I started watching more closely, listening differently, noting which conversations mattered and which were performative, which relationships were reciprocal and which were extractive. That Tuesday afternoon didn't end with a decision or a declaration. It ended with a quiet, internal boundary being drawn. I would no longer confuse patience with passivity. And from that moment on, every choice I made was deliberate. After that day, my silence changed texture. Before it had been soft, reactive, shaped by the desire to keep things smooth. Now it has become firm, intentional. I still didn't speak much in meetings, but not because I had nothing to say. I spoke less because I was deciding when my words actually mattered. Most people didn't notice the difference. Silence looks the same from the outside, regardless of its source. And because I had trained everyone to see my quiet as compliance, they assumed nothing had shifted. That assumption worked in my favor. I stopped volunteering information preemptively. I answered questions precisely, not expansively. When asked for help, I clarified the scope. When pulled into last-minute fixes, I asked how success would be defined. Not defensively, just neutrally. These were small changes, almost invisible, but they altered the flow of energy around me. Some colleagues leaned harder at first. They were used to my elasticity. When I didn't immediately absorb their urgency, they felt it. They mistook my calm boundaries for temporary unavailability, something that would pass. Others filled the silence themselves. They spoke more, explained more, made decisions faster, sometimes without fully understanding the implications. I watched, I listened, I took notes. Silence, when chosen, gives you perspective. I began to see how often people equated speed with leadership and volume with certainty. I noticed how rarely anyone paused to ask whether a decision was actually sound, as long as it felt confident. And I noticed something else. People started to reveal their assumptions. They assumed I would catch issues before they surfaced, that I would smooth over rough edges, that I would quietly intervene if something went wrong. Because that's who I had been. But now, so I let systems show their stress points. I didn't sabotage anything. I didn't withhold critical information. I simply stopped cushioning every impact. When I was asked why something hadn't been flagged earlier, I pointed, calmly, to where responsibility had been reassigned, to decisions made without consultation, to timelines I hadn't approved. No blame, just facts. My manager began to seem slightly unsettled around me, not alarmed, just less certain. They asked more questions, checked in more frequently. I answered honestly, without reassurance. I'm focused on my scope, I would say. Let me know if that changes. That sentence did more work than any confrontation could have. People often think power announces itself, that it arrives with declarations and confidence, but real power often shows up as restraint. By not reacting, I disrupted the pattern. By not filling the silence, I made others hear themselves more clearly. By not overfunctioning, I allowed gaps to appear. And gaps make structures visible. What surprised me most was how quickly others mistook this for weakness, or disengagement, or burnout. She's probably tired, I heard once. Maybe she's just coasting. I let them think that, because underestimation is a kind of cover. While they speculated, I observed, I documented, I learned which processes were brittle and which were resilient. I identified dependencies that lived only in my head, and what would happen if they stayed there. I wasn't plotting revenge. I wasn't even planning an exit yet. I was reclaiming agency. Silence had stopped being something done to me. It had become something I used, selectively, strategically, and without apology. And no one realized yet how much the balance had already shifted. What they never noticed was how much I was learning, while they assumed I was fading. There's a particular freedom that comes when people stop watching you closely. Expectations lower. Scrutiny softens. You're no longer seen as a variable, just a constant. And constants, by definition, are rarely questioned. That's when my preparation truly began. I didn't announce it. I didn't set goals in a visible way. I simply started paying attention to the things I had once taken for granted. I mapped workflows the way they actually operated, not how they were documented. I noted which approvals were ceremonial and which were real. I observed how decisions flowed when certain people were absent, and how quickly things stalled without informal interventions. I paid attention to emails that never received replies, and to the people who stepped in quietly to move things along. I noticed which teams depended on unwritten rules and which depended on individuals. Most importantly, I noticed how much institutional knowledge lived nowhere official. It lived in habits, in memory, in "just ask Elena." That phrase came up more often than I realized. Just ask Elena, she'll know. Elena handled something like this before. Elena can probably fix it. Each time I heard it, I wrote it down, not the compliment, but the dependency. I also began documenting my own work with a level of rigor I hadn't needed before. Not to prove my value, but to understand it. I tracked which processes I maintained, which risks I mitigated, which decisions I influenced indirectly. I didn't rush. This wasn't about speed, it was about accuracy. At the same time, I invested quietly in myself. I updated certifications, learned the financial language leadership used when they thought no one else was listening. I paid attention to how the strategy was framed upward versus downward. I stopped assuming good faith as a default and started observing incentives instead. Who benefited from my silence? Who benefited from my visibility staying low? Who relied on stability more than progress? These weren't accusations, there were questions. And questions, when asked honestly, have a way of rearranging your understanding. No one noticed because nothing I did disrupted the surface. Projects still ran. Deadlines were still met. I was still polite, still professional, still calm. But underneath, I was repositioning. I began declining certain requests, not dramatically, just selectively. I don't have the capacity for that right now. That falls outside my scope. We should clarify ownership before I step in. Each boundary revealed something. Some people respected it immediately, others pushed. A few seemed genuinely confused, as if a rule they'd relied on had quietly changed. I paid attention to those reactions too. I also stopped correcting mistakes that weren't mine to fix. That was the hardest part. Not because I wanted things to fail, but because I had been conditioned to prevent failure at any cost. Letting others experience the consequences of their decisions felt uncomfortable at first, but it also felt honest. And honesty, I was learning, creates clarity. What they never noticed was that I wasn't disengaging. I was detaching from narratives that no longer served me, from roles I hadn't chosen, from expectations built on my compliance. I wasn't planning a dramatic reveal. I wasn't waiting for the perfect moment. I was building leverage quietly, ethically, and patiently. By the time anyone sensed that something was different, the groundwork had already been laid. And by then, the story was no longer about being seen. It was about being ready. The reveal didn't come from a confession or a confrontation. It came from a spreadsheet. I had been reviewing a quarterly operational risk report. One of those documents leadership skimmed for reassurance rather than insight. As I traced dependencies across teams, something clicked. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just clearly. I realized how much of the organization's stability flowed through a set of processes that had no formal owner. And most of those processes ran through me, not because I was officially responsible, but because over time, I had become the quiet point of convergence. When something didn't fit neatly into a role, it landed with me. When a handoff failed, I bridged it. When a system needed interpretation, I provided it. None of this was written down in a way that leadership truly understood. If I stepped away, cleanly, professionally, without sabotage, there would be no immediate explosion. That's what made it invisible. Things would continue until they didn't, until small delays compounded, until minor misunderstandings became operational friction, until risk exposure increased quietly, exactly the way it always had, just without a buffer. This wasn't power in the cinematic sense. It was leverage born of structure. I sat with that realization for a long time, not with excitement, with responsibility, because leverage can be misused. And I had no interest in proving a point through chaos. What I wanted was alignment between my contribution and my autonomy, between my value and my voice. I reviewed my documentation again, this time from a different angle. What would be required to transfer this knowledge properly? Who would need to be trained? How long would it take? What would happen if it weren't? The answers were uncomfortable, not because the company was malicious, but because it had grown around informal solutions instead of formal accountability, around people like me. That's when I understood something crucial. They weren't underestimating me because they didn't value me. They were underestimating me because the system rewarded my silence. And systems don't correct themselves. This wasn't a moment of triumph. There was no satisfaction in realizing how exposed things were. Only clarity. And clarity demands a decision. I didn't tell anyone what I'd discovered. Not my manager, not HR, not a trusted colleague. Because this wasn't information to be shared emotionally. It was something to be acted on deliberately. I began thinking in terms of options, not outcomes. Option 1, stay. Push for recognition, attempt to reshape the role from within. Risk of being labeled difficult. Risk slow change. Option 2, leave quietly. Transfer knowledge fully. Watch from a distance as the organization adjusted or struggled. Option 3, redefine my position entirely. Force a formalization of what had been informal. Risk exposure, risk resistance. Each option carried consequences, not just for me, but for others. I weighed them carefully. The private reveal wasn't that I held leverage. It was then that I no longer needed permission to use it ethically. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want validation. I wanted integrity between what I gave and what I received. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what would happen if I stopped holding everything together. Because now, I understand the truth. Silence had protected everyone else. Clarity would protect me. Once you see the full shape of a situation, not choosing becomes a choice of its own. After the private reveal, I lived in that in-between space for weeks. Still showing up, still delivering, still calm. But internally, I was evaluating every interaction through a different lens. I wasn't asking, how do I make this work? I was asking, what am I consenting to by staying silent? The options I'd outlined began to feel less theoretical and more real. Staying and pushing for recognition seemed reasonable on paper. I could schedule conversations, present documentation, ask for a role that reflected what I actually did. But I knew the culture well enough to understand the cost. Change would be incremental. Resistance would be subtle. And the unspoken expectation that I would continue absorbing risk during the transition would remain. Leaving quietly was tempting, clean, simple. I could protect my peace and let the organization deal with its own structure. But it felt incomplete, not because I owed them, but because it wouldn't resolve the misalignment I'd allowed to grow. The third option, the irreversible one, was the hardest to admit to myself. Not a dramatic ultimatum, not a power play. A boundary so clear that the system would have to respond. I realized that as long as my role remained informal, my value would remain invisible. And as long as I continued to operate in that space, nothing fundamental would change. So I made a decision that surprised even me. I would formalize my work, or I would remove myself from it entirely. That meant preparing for outcomes I couldn't control. It meant accepting that some people would feel blindsided. It meant letting go of the identity I'd built around being indispensable. It also meant acting without resentment. I didn't rush. I consulted legal resources quietly, reviewed my contract, understood my obligations and my rights. I prepared documentation, not as leverage, but as transition material. And then, When everything was ready, I asked for a meeting. Not with a list of grievances, not with emotion, with clarity. I explained my role as it actually existed. The responsibilities I carried, the risks I mitigated, the dependencies I managed. I presented it not as a complaint, but as a fact. Then I outlined 2 paths forward. One involved redefining my position with appropriate authority and scope. The other involved a structured transition of responsibilities over a defined period. I didn't argue. I didn't justify. I didn't threaten. I let the silence do the work. You could feel the shift in the room, not anger, not panic, discomfort, because for the first time the system was being asked to acknowledge what it had quietly relied on. This was the decision point. Not because I demanded anything, but because I stopped pretending nothing was wrong. And once that happens, there is no going back. After that meeting, nothing happened. At least, nothing visible. No announcements, no follow-up emails, no sudden urgency. If anything, the days that followed were strangely quiet, polite, almost careful, as if the organization needed time to recalibrate its internal language before responding. And that was fine, because I had already moved. What most people don't understand is that the most consequential actions rarely look dramatic in real time. They look like paperwork, like a calendar holds, like documents being reviewed and revised quietly, line by line. I continued doing my job, but only the job as it was formally defined. No extra buffering, no anticipatory fixes, no silent rescues. I documented handoffs precisely. If a decision required approval, I waited for it. If information was missing, I requested it in writing. Calmly, professionally, without urgency. The organization was used to me smoothing friction before it surfaced. Now, friction surfaced exactly where it belonged, and still, no one openly reacted. Leadership met behind closed doors. I wasn't invited. That, too, was data. Meanwhile, I began the legal and financial steps that didn't require permission. I spoke with a career advisor, not about next moves, but about alignment. I reviewed my savings, updated my CV with language that reflected reality, not modesty. I reached out to 2 contacts quietly, not to complain, just to explore. At work, people assumed I was still fully available. They looped me into conversations late, asked for quick opinions, expected continuity. I didn't push back. I simply responded with precision, happy to support once ownership is clarified. That would require additional scope. Who's accountable? I'll need that decision documented before proceeding. These sentences are not confrontational, but they change the air in a room. Some colleagues adjusted quickly. Others seemed irritated but couldn't articulate why. A few tried to bypass the process, to recreate the old patterns. I didn't block them. I redirected them. And slowly, quietly, something began to happen. Delays appeared, not catastrophic ones, just enough to be noticed. Decisions took longer. Follow-ups multiplied. Questions that used to die in my inbox started resurfacing in leadership channels. No one could point to a single cause. Nothing was wrong. But things were no longer seamless, and because I wasn't reacting emotionally, there was no one to blame. I was still there, still professional, still calm, but no longer compensating. Behind the scenes, HR reached out, not urgently, just to check in. I answered honestly, without elaboration. I'm focused on alignment, I said. That's all. They thanked me, said they'd be in touch. They weren't. I noticed how often my name came up in meetings I wasn't part of, how frequently people referenced transition risk without naming it, how carefully language was chosen around responsibility. Still, no one asked me to return to the old role. No one apologized. No one acknowledged the imbalance directly, because to do so would have meant admitting it had existed. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy, it's about restraint. I wasn't trying to force a reaction. I was allowing the system to experience itself without my invisible labor. And once that happens, things never return to their original shape. The consequences didn't arrive as a crisis. they arrived in confusion. Small, contained moments where people realized something they'd relied on was no longer automatic. A missed assumption, a delayed approval, a question that circled without landing. At first, it was subtle enough to ignore. A project update was pushed back a week, a compliance review that required rework, a client request that sat unresolved longer than expected. Individually, none of these were alarming. Together, they formed a pattern. One leadership couldn't quite name. I started receiving more messages, not requests exactly, more like feelers. Hey, quick question. Just checking if you're looped into this. Can you take a look when you have a second? I responded thoughtfully. Sometimes I could help within scope. Sometimes I redirected. This falls under X's ownership. That decision was made in wise meeting. I'd need formal approval to proceed. No defensiveness, no explanations beyond what was necessary. What changed was the tone of the replies. People were less certain, less casual. They reread messages before sending them, followed up more carefully, included others in CC who had never needed to be there before. Uncertainty has a way of spreading upward. Managers began asking for status updates more frequently. Meetings were added to align. The word visibility started appearing in conversations, spoken with the kind of concern usually reserved for risk. Still, no one confronted me, because nothing I was doing violated expectations. In fact, I was finally operating exactly within them. The real consequence wasn't the delay, it was exposure. Without my quiet interventions, the seams between teams became visible. Assumptions that had been patched over for years began to fray. The difference between ownership and effort became harder to ignore. And for the first time, people started to feel the absence of something they'd never acknowledged. I overheard a comment in a meeting I wasn't meant to be part of. Things used to move faster. Yes, but we were also taking shortcuts. Well, someone used to catch that. Someone, not me, not my name, but I knew what they meant. And so did they, even if they wouldn't say it. There was a quiet panic beneath the surface. Not fear of failure, but fear of unpredictability. Systems had been built on the assumption of my availability. Now that assumption was unreliable. HR reached out again, this time with more structure. A conversation was scheduled. No agenda. I attended. Calm, prepared. They asked how I was feeling. I answered honestly, without emotion. I'm focused on sustainability, I said, for the role and for myself. They nodded, took notes, asked what support I needed. I didn't ask for reassurance. I didn't plead. I asked about next steps. That question landed differently, because consequences aren't always about loss. Sometimes they're about realization. The organization was beginning to understand that something fundamental had shifted, and that it hadn't been announced. It had simply stopped being free. By the time they tried to fix it, the problem was no longer logistical. It was temporal. The organization moved the way large systems always do, slowly at first, then all at once. Committees were formed. Titles were reviewed. Consultants were mentioned. All signs that leadership had finally acknowledged something structural had been left unattended for too long. But acknowledgement is not the same as readiness. I was invited into a series of conversations that felt, on the surface, collaborative. There were questions about my workload, my career goals, and my long-term vision with the company. The language shifted from casual reliance to careful negotiation. I answered honestly, but narrowly. What they were really asking was simpler than their words. Can we go back to how it was? And the answer, though I never said it aloud, was no. Not because I was unwilling, because the conditions no longer existed. They proposed adjustments, a revised title, a dotted line authority, a promise of future review. All reasonable, all too late. Not late in the sense of missed opportunity, but late in the sense that the underlying trust had already been redefined. Trust isn't broken only by betrayal. It's broken by prolonged misalignment. For years, I had aligned myself with the organization's needs without requiring alignment in return. Now that I was asking for it explicitly, the imbalance became impossible to ignore. The most telling moment came in a meeting with senior leadership. One of them said earnestly, "We didn't realize how much was resting on you." I believed them, and that was the problem. Because if they hadn't realized it then, they hadn't built anything around it. And if they were only realizing it now, they were already behind. You can't retroactively formalize years of invisible labor without consequences. You can't suddenly assign ownership to systems that grew around silence. You can't ask someone to step back into a role that no longer fits the structure or their self-respect. They weren't trying to exploit me. They were trying to preserve continuity. But continuity required me to return to being the buffer. And I wouldn't, not angrily, not defiantly, just clearly. I told them I would support a transition, but not a reset, that I was willing to document, train, and hand over responsibly, that I would not continue operating in an undefined space. There was a pause. In that pause, I saw something shift in their expressions, not hostility, but regret. Not about losing me, but about not seeing me sooner. They asked if there was anything they could do to change my mind. I thought carefully before answering. Earlier alignment, I said, would have. It wasn't an accusation, it was a fact. From that moment on, the conversation changed tone. Less negotiation, more logistics, timelines, knowledge transfer, risk mitigation. The fix they wanted, returning to seamless operation, was no longer possible, because what had made it seamless was my willingness to absorb everything quietly. And that era had ended. The confrontation, when it finally came, was almost disappointingly calm. No raised voices, no emotional appeals, just two people sitting across a table, acknowledging something that could no longer be avoided. It was my direct manager who asked for the meeting, not HR, not leadership, them. They looked tired, not defensive, not angry, just worn down by the slow realization that something fundamental had shifted under their watch. "I wish you had said something earlier," they began. I let the silence sit, because I had, just not loudly. When I spoke, I kept my voice even. "I did," I said, in the way that felt possible at the time. They nodded, but I could tell they were still grappling with it. From their perspective, I had been stable, available, fine, and stability in corporate life is often mistaken for consent. They talked about pressures, about expectations from above, about how easy it is to lose track when someone never complains. I listened. I didn't interrupt. Not because I agreed, but because this wasn't a debate. When they finished, I responded simply. "I understand the system you are working within," I said, "but I also have to work within my own." That landed. They asked what I wanted now. I didn't list grievances. I didn't revisit the past. "I want to leave things better than I found them," I said, "for whoever comes next, and for myself." We talked through the transition, timelines, documentation, support boundaries. Everything was clear, clean, professional. At one point, they said something that surprised me. "I didn't realize how much you were carrying." I didn't respond immediately, because the truth was, I had helped make that invisible. So I said the only honest thing. I didn't either, not at first. There was no apology, none was needed. What mattered was recognition, not emotional, but structural. When the meeting ended, there was no dramatic closure, just a quiet understanding that this chapter was done. The confrontation hadn't been about blame. It had been about clarity. And clarity, once spoken, doesn't require volume. Who I am now is quieter than before, but not smaller. For a long time, I believed growth meant expansion. More responsibility, more visibility, more endurance. I thought strength was measured by how much I could carry without complaint. I don't believe that anymore. Leaving that role didn't feel like an escape. It felt like completion. I had seen the system clearly, named my place within it, and chosen not to disappear inside it any longer. In my current work, my boundaries are visible from the beginning. Scope is defined, authority is explicit, silence is no longer assumed to mean availability. When I speak, it's because the decision requires it, not because I'm filling space. I'm still calm, still thoughtful, still observant. But I no longer confuse composure with self-erasure. The biggest change isn't external, it's internal. I trust my own perception now. When something feels misaligned, I don't rationalize it away. I examine it. When I notice patterns forming, I don't wait years to name them. I document early, I ask clear questions, and I watch how people respond. Not to judge, but to understand. I no longer need to be indispensable to feel valuable. That need was a trap. It kept me useful and quiet, effective and unseen. Now I measure value differently, by mutual clarity, by respect that doesn't rely on endurance, by work that doesn't require invisibility to function. There's no bitterness in this version of me. I don't speak poorly of my former colleagues. They weren't villains. They were participants in a structure that rewarded certain behaviors and overlooked others. I was one of them. What changed was not the system alone, but my willingness to disappear inside it. I still carry my black notebook, not out of habit, but as a reminder. It's mostly empty now. I don't need it the way I used to, but it represents something important: awareness. Awareness of how easily quiet competence can be consumed. Awareness of how often silence is mistaken for agreement. Awareness of how power accumulates, not through force, but through clarity. I don't dominate rooms. I don't need to. Quiet dominance isn't about control. It's about alignment, about knowing when to speak, when to wait, and when to walk away. Who I am now is someone who doesn't wait to be seen. I make myself legible. There's a lesson people often expect at the end of stories like this. Something sharp, something satisfying, a sentence that feels like justice being served. But the truth is quieter than that. What happened to me wasn't rare. It wasn't extreme. It didn't require villains or cruelty. It happened because silence is often rewarded, right up until it becomes invisible. And invisibility, when sustained long enough, becomes a kind of consent others don't even realize they're taking. The moral of this story isn't speak up sooner, because that advice ignores how power actually works. It ignores fear, context, dependency, and the real cost of being labeled difficult. Silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's survival. The real question is different. At what point does silence stop protecting you and start protecting everyone else at your expense? I didn't reclaim myself by shouting. I didn't do it by exposing anyone or humiliating a system. I did it by becoming clear, first internally, then structurally. I stopped donating invisible labor. I stopped absorbing misalignment. I stopped hoping clarity would arrive on its own. And when I did that, the outcome wasn't revenge. It was released. If there's one thing I hope you take from this, it's this. You don't owe anyone your invisibility. You don't owe a system your silence. And you don't need to become louder to become stronger. Quiet dominance is not about winning. It's about choosing yourself without theatrics. It's about walking away whole. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been the reliable one, the calm one, the person who held things together quietly, I'd really like to hear from you.